The Mitchell family thought they had finally found peace. After years of saving, working long hours and sacrificing luxuries, David and Laura Mitchell purchased what they believed was their forever home. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect for them. A cozy two-story house with soft beige siding, a wraparound porch, and a small backyard garden. It was nestled inside a quiet, gated community, supposedly a safe, well-maintained neighborhood, ideal for raising their two children. For the first few months, life seemed perfect. The children played in the backyard, Laura filled the porch with flowers, and David took pride in maintaining the lawn. The neighbors appeared friendly, at least on the surface, and the community seemed orderly. But slowly, subtle signs emerged that hinted at something darker lurking beneath the polished image of the neighborhood. The first letter came tucked under their doormat, stamped with the seal of the Homeowners Association. It was phrased politely, but carried a tone of authority. According to the HOA, the shade of beige used on their siding was slightly outside the approved color palette. The Mitchells brushed it off as a minor misunderstanding, confident that such a trivial issue could be easily resolved. They had, after all, purchased the home in that exact color. It wasn't even their choice. Weeks later, another letter arrived, this one more formal and less forgiving. It accused them of aesthetic non-compliance, threatening daily fines, unless they repainted their home to match the approved shades. Confused and unsettled, David reached out to the HOA board, but the response was cold. The board claimed the previous owner had never properly filed the color variance request, meaning the Mitchells were now responsible for correcting the violation. At first, the family tried to comply. They looked into the approved palette, only to find the suggested paints would cost thousands of dollars they didn't have. And even if they could afford it, the colors were nearly identical to the beige they already had. It felt absurd, but when David attempted to reason with the HOA president, a sharp, stone-faced woman named Evelyn Hart, he was met with hostility. Evelyn insisted the family repaint or face escalating fines. Her words carried an unshakable finality, as if the decision had already been made long before the Mitchells moved in. As weeks passed, the situation worsened. Letters became more aggressive. Neighbors who once smiled politely began avoiding eye contact. Some whispered as the family walked past, while others seemed to relish their discomfort. It was as though the Mitchells had been quietly marked as outsiders, targeted for reasons they didn't yet understand. Then came the shocking notice that would change everything. The HOA demanded that the Mitchells remedy their violations within 30 days or vacate the property. The letter cited obscure clauses buried deep within the community's bylaws, rules that no ordinary homeowner could possibly keep track of. The ultimatum was clear: comply or leave. The Mitchells were stunned. They had spent their life savings on the home, believing it was a safe place to raise their children. Now the HOA was trying to strip it away over something as meaningless as the shade of paint. Laura grew anxious, fearing they would lose everything. David, though shaken, grew determined. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just about paint. The language in the notices felt calculated, as if they were being pushed out intentionally. But why? That question haunted him late into the nights. He began digging through every letter, every clause, and every scrap of paperwork the HOA had sent. He pored over community bylaws, cross-checking them with their deed and property documents. Hours turned into days, and soon David realized the inconsistencies were more than simple clerical errors. There were contradictions, outdated policies, and questionable signatures. And then, buried within a forgotten file from the county records, he found something strange, something that hinted the HOA's actions weren't about compliance at all. There was money involved, a lot of money. The Mitchells had been pushed into a corner, but David wasn't about to surrender. What started as a petty dispute over paint was about to unravel into something much bigger, something that could shake the entire neighborhood and expose the truth behind the HOA's corruption. The nightmare had only just begun. The more David looked into the HOA's demands, the more he realized something wasn't adding up. What began as a supposed paint color issue had spiraled into an eviction threat, an escalation far beyond reason. That alone raised alarms. But the deeper he dug, the stranger things became. The HOA bylaws, which should have been a straightforward document outlining community rules, were riddled with vague language and inconsistencies. Some sections contradicted others. Certain rules appeared to be added without proper signatures or dates. And oddly, some clauses seemed to give the HOA broad power to target specific properties. Under the guise of aesthetic preservation, David couldn't shake the feeling that the Mitchells weren't the first family to be targeted. To confirm his suspicions, he began talking quietly with neighbors, though many were reluctant to speak. Most waved off his questions, claiming they didn't want to get involved. A few, however, let small details slip. One elderly couple whispered that another family, the Carters, had been fined so heavily for landscaping violations that they eventually sold their home under pressure. Another neighbor mentioned a single mother who had faced relentless complaints about her driveway until she too left. The pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't simply enforcing rules. They were selectively targeting families, forcing them out, and then reselling the homes. But why? The answer came late one evening as David scrolled through public county records. Buried in the property transfers, he noticed something alarming. Multiple homes in the neighborhood had changed hands within just a few years, far more frequently than in surrounding communities. And in several cases, those homes had been bought at unusually low prices, sometimes by shell companies, sometimes by buyers with vague connections to the HOA board itself. It was no coincidence. The HOA was manufacturing violations, forcing families out and paving the way for cheap sales. David shared his findings with Laura, who at first was horrified, then furious. Their dream home had been a carefully laid trap. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was running a scheme, profiting off the misery of homeowners, but they couldn't expose it with speculation alone. They needed hard evidence. David began, attending HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back, while Evelyn Hart, the president, presided over the board. Her tone was commanding, her rules unyielding. The other board members nodded obediently, rarely speaking unless to agree with her decisions. At first glance, the meetings appeared orderly and professional, but David noticed the subtle avoidance of certain topics. Financial reports were rushed, with vague numbers and no supporting documentation. Homeowner complaints were dismissed quickly, sometimes mocked behind polite smiles. Most telling of all was Evelyn's attitude toward him. Whenever David asked about the supposed violations against his home, she deflected, insisting he follow procedure and submit formal requests that conveniently never received responses. It was a bureaucratic loop designed to wear him down, but David didn't give up. After each meeting, he collected scraps of information, dates, names, and mentions of contractors hired by the HOA. Piece by piece, he built a timeline of decisions that seemed to benefit the same small circle of people. Then came the turning point. One night, unable to sleep, David combed through more county documents and stumbled across a contractor's report filed months earlier. It was a landscaping invoice, charging the HOA thousands of dollars for services that were never performed. Curious, David cross-checked it with his own observations. He had walked by the common areas dozens of times and never saw evidence of that kind of work being done. The invoice was fraudulent. It was the first solid proof that the HOA was misusing funds. But if that was true, how many other invoices were fake? How much money had disappeared into the pockets of the board. David realized he was in dangerous territory. Evelyn wasn't just a strict HOA president. She was orchestrating a system of corruption, and if she had gone to such lengths to cover her tracks, she wouldn't take kindly to someone exposing the truth. Laura begged him to be careful. Children were already unsettled by the tension in the neighborhood. Strangers gave them cold stares, and one morning they woke to find an anonymous note stuffed in their mailbox. Comply or leave. The message was clear. The HOA wanted them gone. But David wasn't about to be bullied. If the HOA thought it could silence him, they underestimated just how determined he was. Armed with the fraudulent invoice, he began contacting former homeowners who had left under HOA pressure. Some refused to speak, still shaken by the experience, but others opened up, their voices filled with bitterness. They described fines that escalated out of control, petty violations used as leverage, and mysterious buyers who swooped in to purchase their homes once they finally gave up. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. It was running a coordinated scheme of intimidation, fraud, and profit, and the Mitchells were the latest targets. But if David wanted to bring this corruption to light, he would need more than scattered documents and whispered testimonies. He needed undeniable proof, records, financial statements, evidence that tied Evelyn Hart directly to the fraud. And as he prepared for his next move, he realized there was only one way to get it. He would have to dig deeper than ever before, even if it meant putting himself and his family directly in the crosshairs of the HOA's wrath. The Mitchells weren't backing down. The fight for their home had turned into something bigger, a fight for justice. David knew that piecing together scraps of information wouldn't be enough. If he truly wanted to expose the HOA, he needed their own records, the documents Evelyn and her board guarded so carefully. But those files weren't easy to get. The HOA made sure financial statements were vague, hiding the details in layers of bureaucratic jargon. Still, David wasn't entirely powerless. By law, HOA members had the right to request certain financial disclosures. It wasn't widely publicized, and Evelyn clearly counted on homeowners being too intimidated or too uninformed to ask. But David wasn't about to play into her hands. Armed with that knowledge, he submitted a formal written request for full access to the HOA's recent financials, including invoices, payments, and budgets. For weeks, he heard nothing. Then, one evening, an envelope arrived at their doorstep. Inside was a brief note from Evelyn herself. Your request is under review. Please refrain from further inquiries until the board has had time to evaluate your concerns. The message was curt, dismissive, and most telling of all, deliberately vague. David understood what it really meant. Stall tactics. Evelyn was buying time, hoping he would give up, but David had no intention of backing down. Instead, he doubled his efforts. Late nights were spent scouring online forums where other homeowners across the country shared horror stories of corrupt HOAs. Many described eerily similar schemes, phony violations, endless fines, and boards funneling money to themselves through fake contracts. It was a nationwide pattern, and Evelyn had perfected it in their neighborhood. The more David uncovered, the angrier he became. His anger, however, was mixed with fear. He knew Evelyn would retaliate if she realized how deep he was digging, and sure enough, the retaliation came. The next week, the Mitchells received 3 violation notices in a single day, one for their mailbox being non-compliant because the paint had faded slightly, another for excessive foliage because Laura's flower pots extended an inch beyond the porch rail, and the last one, almost laughable, accused them of unauthorized lawn ornaments, referring to a small wind chime hanging by their front steps. It was harassment, pure and simple. The message was clear. Stop digging, or face ruin. Laura was distraught. The children asked why their home was always in trouble, their innocent questions cutting deeper than the fines themselves. But David's resolve only hardened. He couldn't walk away now, not when he was so close to proving what was really happening. And then fate handed him the opportunity he needed. At the next HOA meeting, Evelyn announced that updated financials would be presented briefly for transparency. David made sure to be there, sitting quietly at the back, while the board shuffled papers and projected vague charts onto a screen. The numbers were polished, rounded neatly into categories like maintenance, landscaping, and miscellaneous expenditures. It looked clean at a glance, too clean. But in their rush to gloss over the details, Evelyn made a mistake. One line item on the chart caught David's attention: a $25,000 expense listed under landscaping enhancement, charged to a contractor's name he recognized from the fraudulent invoice he'd already found. David raised his hand calmly, asking for clarification on what that enhancement entailed. Evelyn's response was sharp, her tone bristling with annoyance. She dismissed the question as internal matters not relevant to homeowners. But David pressed, pointing out that homeowners were paying those dues and had a right to know exactly how funds were spent. The room fell silent. Neighbors shifted, uncomfortably in their chairs. For a moment, Evelyn's mask slipped. Her smile faltered, and her eyes narrowed with hostility. It was the first open confrontation. Evelyn quickly regained composure, cutting David off and ending the meeting abruptly. But the damage was done. Several neighbors approached him afterward, quietly expressing their suspicions. Some admitted they'd long wondered why fees kept rising while little seemed to improve around the community. Evelyn's iron grip had kept them silent, but now cracks were forming. That night, David realized something important. Evelyn thrived on fear and silence. The more homeowners questioned her, the weaker her control became. Still, he needed hard proof, something undeniable, that even Evelyn couldn't spin. That meant finding the original records, the unedited documents Evelyn was hiding. One evening, while walking past the HOA office, David noticed a light on inside, even though it was after hours. Through the window, he saw Evelyn hunched over stacks of papers, her movements quick and deliberate, as though she were destroying or hiding something. He froze, his heart pounding. She wasn't just running a sloppy scheme, she was covering her tracks. The image haunted him all night. If Evelyn was willing to falsify or destroy documents, then every day he delayed brought him closer to losing the only chance at exposing her. The next morning, David made his decision. He would find a way to get those records, legally or not. Evelyn might control the board, but she couldn't control the truth forever. The Mitchells had been pushed into a corner, but now the tide was beginning to turn. Evelyn had revealed her fear, and David knew he was getting closer. What he didn't know, however, was that Evelyn was already preparing her next move, one that would put his entire family at risk. The real battle for their home, and for the neighborhood's future, was about to begin. David knew time was slipping away. Every new violation notice that appeared in his mailbox was a reminder that Evelyn wasn't going to stop until his family was driven out. The HOA had nearly limitless power on paper, and Evelyn knew exactly how to wield it. But David had one thing she didn't: a growing determination to expose the truth. The challenge was access. He needed the raw, unfiltered records, the invoices, the contracts, the financial ledgers Evelyn kept hidden from homeowners. Without those, all he had were suspicions and fragments. But the board wasn't about to hand them over willingly. That's when David remembered something from the bylaws he had read over and over. Buried in the fine print was a section stating that any HOA member, upon written request, had the right to inspect financial records at reasonable times. It was a clause Evelyn had deliberately ignored when dismissing his earlier request. The law was on his side. Armed with that knowledge, David sent a certified letter demanding access. The response, of course, was another denial. Evelyn claimed his request was disruptive and outside the scope of transparency. But now David had proof of her non-compliance. If she continued to deny him, it would strengthen his case. In court, while preparing to escalate legally, David also pursued another angle. Through quiet conversations, he had built a small network of allies among the neighbors. Some had lived under Evelyn's reign for years, too fearful to speak up, but secretly resentful. Now, with David openly challenging her, they began sharing their stories. One neighbor handed him copies of old violation letters, nearly identical in wording to the ones David's family had received, only with different details swapped out. Another recalled seeing board members celebrating with drinks at Evelyn's house shortly after a targeted family sold their home at a steep loss. Each story added weight to the picture David was building, but the real breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, a neighbor named Carlos, who had recently been fined into near bankruptcy by the HOA, knocked on David's door. His voice was hushed, his eyes darting nervously. He handed David a small USB drive. "I used to do IT work for the HOA," he admitted. "They fired me when I started asking questions. I copied some files before they locked me out. I don't know what's on here, but you should look." David's hands trembled as he accepted it. That night, after the kids were asleep, he plugged the drive into his computer. What appeared on the screen left him stunned. The drive contained dozens of documents, scanned invoices, emails, spreadsheets, many marked as confidential. As he scrolled, the pieces fell into place. There were invoices for landscaping services billed at outrageous amounts, signed off by Evelyn herself. Payments to shell companies with no physical address, email chains between Evelyn and select board members discussing ensuring compliance with targeted families, thinly veiled language that revealed their strategy to drive homeowners out. One email chilled David to the core. Evelyn wrote to a contractor, "The Mitchell property should be next. Once they're gone, we can push for the rezoning project. Make sure everything is documented." Rezoning project? David's eyes narrowed. He dug deeper and found references to a proposed commercial development, a shopping plaza that would require demolishing several homes along their street. The HOA wasn't just targeting families for profit on resales. They were clearing space for a lucrative land deal. The Mitchell's home was in the center of the planned project. That's why Evelyn had been relentless. It was never about paint, colors, or flower pots. It was about removing them to make way for a payday. Laura sat beside him, her face pale as he explained what he had uncovered. Their family wasn't just unlucky. They had been marked from the moment they bought the house. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on them. They had the proof now, but proof wasn't enough on its own. Exposing Evelyn would mean going public, risking retaliation, and potentially dragging their entire community into a scandal. But doing nothing meant losing their home, their savings, and their dignity. David knew what he had to do. He began compiling the documents into a detailed report, cross-referencing invoices with county records, attaching screenshots of emails, and creating a timeline of events. He wasn't just gathering evidence, he was building a case, but Evelyn wasn't blind. She sensed his defiance. Within days, the Mitchells received the harshest notice yet, an order demanding immediate compliance with all outstanding violations or face foreclosure proceedings. It was the nuclear option. The HOA was attempting to seize their home outright. The letter shook Laura deeply. Tears welled in her eyes as she imagined packing their children's belongings, forced to abandon the life they had built. But David's anger overpowered his fear. Evelyn had overplayed her hand. By moving so aggressively, she had given him the final push to act. The very next morning, David made an appointment with a local attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Carrying the USB drive and his carefully compiled evidence, he laid out everything: the fraudulent invoices, the emails, the threats, the foreclosure notice. The attorney's eyes widened with every page he turned. "You have them," the lawyer finally said. "This isn't just harassment. This is fraud, abuse of power, and potentially criminal activity." For the first time in months, David felt hope. But hope came with a cost. Filing a lawsuit against the HOA would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. Evelyn would retaliate with everything she had, and the process could drag on for months, maybe years. Still, there was no turning back. David had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to bring it into the light. The Mitchells had started this battle, fighting for their home. Now they were fighting for justice, for themselves, for their neighbors, and for every family Evelyn had forced out before them. The stage was set for a showdown that would expose the HOA's darkest secrets. And as David prepared for what came next, he knew there was no safe way out. The only path forward was through the storm. The decision to move forward with legal action changed everything for the Mitchells. No longer were they quietly fending off violation notices in the shadows. They were preparing to take on the very institution that ruled their neighborhood. The lawsuit was filed swiftly. David's attorney submitted a thick stack of evidence: fraudulent invoices, shell company payments, suspicious emails, and the damning message about the rezoning project. The court issued an order preventing the HOA from moving forward with foreclosure until the case was resolved. For the first time, Evelyn's grip on the Mitchells' home had been broken, but the legal battle was only beginning. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers as news of the lawsuit spread. At first, many residents were skeptical. The HOA had cultivated a reputation for protecting property values, and Evelyn had long presented herself as the tireless defender of order. But when neighbors learned of the foreclosure attempt against the Mitchells, doubt began to creep in. People started questioning why so many families had voluntarily moved out in the past. The next HOA meeting was unlike any before. Instead of the usual handful of residents, the room was packed wall to wall. Dozens came not to hear Evelyn, but to see David. Evelyn tried to maintain control, gavel in hand, her voice sharp as she declared the meeting business as usual. But murmurs rose from the crowd, and when David calmly stood and mentioned the pending lawsuit, silence fell. He didn't reveal everything. His lawyer had advised caution, but he said enough. He mentioned questionable financial practices, misuse of funds, and the board's failure to respond to lawful requests for transparency. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes narrowing toward the board. Evelyn cut him off, her tone icy, accusing him of spreading lies and endangering the harmony of the community. But the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn's once loyal support began to fracture. Neighbors who had quietly suffered under her rule now felt emboldened. Some reached out to David, offering to testify about their own experiences. Others dug through their old records, producing letters and fines eerily similar to what the Mitchells had endured. The lawsuit grew stronger with every new piece of testimony. What had started as one family's fight was turning into a collective rebellion. Evelyn, however, was not about to surrender. She doubled down on her tactics, issuing new violation notices to anyone she suspected of siding with David. Lawn ornaments, unapproved shrubs, minor cracks in driveways, all suddenly became grounds for fines. The intimidation was blatant, but instead of breaking spirits, it united the neighborhood further. Residents began meeting informally at one another's homes, discussing strategies, pooling their stories, and rallying around the Mitchells. The turning point came when a local reporter caught wind of the story. Drawn by the unusual lawsuit and whispers of HOA corruption, the reporter interviewed David and several neighbors. Within days, an article appeared online headlined, "Homeowners Fight Back, HOA Accused of Fraud and Harassment." The story spread quickly, shared on social media, picked up by larger outlets, and soon the quiet gated community was no longer so quiet. News vans parked along the streets, cameras capturing shots of the once pristine neighborhood now under scrutiny. Evelyn despised the attention. Her carefully crafted image of order was unraveling in front of the entire city. When the court date arrived, the tension was unbearable. In the packed courtroom, residents filled the benches, eager to see the outcome. Evelyn sat rigid at the defense table, her lawyer speaking confidently but with less substance than David's side. The Mitchells' attorney laid out the evidence piece by piece: the fraudulent invoices, the shell companies, the emails about targeting families. Each revelation was like a hammer striking the board's credibility. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern. Evelyn's lawyer tried to dismiss the documents as misunderstood accounting, but the evidence was overwhelming. The fraudulent invoices alone painted a damning picture. And when neighbors testified about their own harassment, fines, threats, sudden foreclosure notices, the pattern was undeniable. Then came the most devastating moment. David's attorney presented the email where Evelyn explicitly wrote about removing the Mitchells for the rezoning project. Gasps filled the courtroom. It was the smoking gun, proof that the HOA's actions weren't about aesthetics or compliance at all, but about profit. Evelyn's composure cracked. For the first time, the iron-fisted president looked shaken, her mask slipping as whispers rippled through the crowd. The judge didn't issue an immediate ruling, but the momentum had shifted entirely. The court ordered a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances, freezing its accounts until the investigation was complete. Evelyn was removed from day-to-day control pending the outcome. The neighborhood exploded with chatter that evening. Some residents celebrated openly, relieved that Evelyn's reign of terror was ending. Others remained cautious, waiting to see if justice would truly be served. But one thing was clear: the once feared HOA president was no longer untouchable. For David and Laura, the moment was bittersweet. They had protected their home for now, but the fight wasn't finished. The audit would take time, and Evelyn still had her loyalists on the board. Retaliation was possible, and though the court had exposed much, the full depth of the corruption was still hidden. Yet for the first time in months, the Mitchells felt a glimmer of peace. They weren't alone anymore. The neighborhood was awakening, the truth was spreading, and the walls Evelyn had built around her empire of control were beginning to crumble. The storm wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The weeks following, the courtroom confrontation were the most tense the neighborhood had ever seen. What once had been a pristine, picture-perfect community was now the focus of nightly news segments, investigative reporters, and curious onlookers who slowed their cars to gawk at the scandal unfolding behind its gates. The forensic audit, ordered by the court, dragged on for days that felt like years. Auditors combed through every transaction, every contract, every line item in the HOA's financial history. Residents watched uneasily as strangers carried boxes of files out of the HOA office. Evelyn Hart was nowhere to be seen. The woman who once strutted through the community issuing commands had gone silent, retreating into her home with blinds perpetually drawn. But silence could not save her. The audit results were devastating. Over the course of 6 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned away through fraudulent invoices, shell companies, and kickback schemes. Contracts were awarded to businesses owned by Evelyn's relatives. Landscaping projects billed at tens of thousands of dollars had never been performed. Even community events listed in the budget turned out to be nothing more than catered. and parties at Evelyn's private residence, paid for with HOA dues. The most damning revelation, however, was the rezoning project. Emails, financial projections, and even draft contracts revealed Evelyn's plan to push multiple families out, demolish their homes, and sell the land to a developer. She had stood to profit personally in the millions. The Mitchell family's ordeal was not random. It was the centerpiece of her plan. When the results were presented in court, Evelyn's empire collapsed. Her attorney tried to argue mismanagement rather than fraud, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge ruled decisively. Evelyn was removed permanently from the HOA board, barred from holding any fiduciary role in the future, and referred to prosecutors for potential criminal charges. The courtroom erupted in gasps, whispers, and finally, applause from the homeowners who had suffered under her rule. For years they had endured her fines, her threats, her arrogance. Now justice was finally catching up. Evelyn, once the untouchable queen of the neighborhood, left the courthouse in disgrace, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions she refused to answer. But the story did not end with her downfall. Turkish HOA itself was placed under court-appointed management until a new, democratically elected board could be formed. For the first time in years, residents had a voice. Neighbors who once lived in fear now stood tall, determined to rebuild their community free of corruption. Committees were formed, rules were revised, and transparency became the standard. And at the heart of it all were the Mitchells. David and Laura were hailed as the couple who stood their ground, the family who refused to bow to intimidation. Their bravery had sparked a movement that freed the neighborhood from tyranny. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now knocked on their door to thank them. Children who had once been told to stay quiet about HOA matters now played freely, in the streets, without fear of complaints. For the Mitchells, the victory was more than just keeping their home. It was reclaiming their peace of mind. Their house, once a symbol of endless stress and looming threats, became again what it was meant to be, a sanctuary. The porch flowers bloomed without criticism, the wind chime rang without notice, and the beige siding stood proudly as a reminder that what mattered wasn't paint color, but perseverance. Months later, Evelyn was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Her once fearsome name was now synonymous with greed and corruption, her reputation destroyed, beyond repair. She sold her home quietly and disappeared, leaving behind a legacy of shame. The neighborhood moved forward, stronger than before. The new board, made up of honest residents, focused on restoring trust. Dues were reduced after the unnecessary. Expenses were cut. Projects that had been neglected were finally completed properly. And most importantly, homeowners felt safe again. For David, the journey left scars. Sleepless nights, endless worry, and the weight of carrying his family through a nightmare had taken its toll. But it also left him with pride. He had not only defended his family's dream home, he had defended the rights of every neighbor around him. On a quiet evening, months after the ordeal, David stood on the porch watching his children chase fireflies in the yard. Laura joined him, her hand slipping into his. For the first time in a long time, they felt at peace. The house they had fought so hard for wasn't just a home. It was a testament to resilience, proof that even against corruption and intimidation, truth could prevail. And in the hearts of everyone who had lived under Evelyn's rule, one truth echoed louder than any gavel strike or headline. No tyrant, no matter how powerful, could hold a neighborhood hostage forever. The HOA that once sought to destroy the Mitchell family had instead destroyed itself, and from its ashes a stronger, freer community was born. The nightmare was over. The Mitchells had won.